So this is India Simmons interviewing Miss Cynthia Salinas Dooley on June 19th, 2018 in the Texana room. So Miss Dooley, why don't you start off by telling us when and where were you born?
I was born 1949 in Laredo, Texas, on the border. Okay. And my parents, both from Mexico. So sometimes I say that I'm really a Mexican who just happened by accident to be born in the U.S.
How would you describe your neighborhood growing up?
Well, Laredo, actually, we just lived there until I was about 6. Then we came to live in Dallas. That was 1955. And we came to, in the neighborhood that used to be called Little Mexico, which is the uptown area now, just north of Dallas. And the reason we came to that neighborhood was because my dad was born and raised as a Methodist in Mexico, which is probably like 20 Methodists in the whole country. But back then, he was told when he came here to work, he says, you need to go to this church because it had already been established. It was established in 1923 as the first Mexican Methodist mission, right there in Harry Hines and what is now Olive. And so he had that connection, and so church was really, really the center of our lives. And we lived just not very far away. That was our first neighborhood. And everybody, our neighbors, a lot of them went to the church. They all lived around the area of the church. And other people, it was just very, it's like living in a small town actually in Dallas. I'm talking about the early 60s, really, that experience. And then we moved to the West Luffield area, which is just west of Luffield Airport, between Harry Hines again, just down the street, to in the airport. That's the little neighborhood. Mm-hmm.
Will you tell us a little about your family?
But my family, okay. My father was Pablo Salinas. He died in 1992, so he's supremely important, my dad and my mom. My mother, Irma Salinas, died last year, May 7th. She lived to be almost 90 years old. She would have been 89. And both of them, they were just the very, very best. I couldn't ask for better parents. And they were, I guess, the strongest influence. Now, what I'll tell you about them that is unusual is that my father, remember I said that he was Methodist, my grandmother was very Methodist, but my mother was very devout Catholic. My grandmother, my great-grandmother, they went to Mass every single day. Took my mother with them. And so when they married, this kind of was just a little barrier. My father was very, very accepting, and he would take my mom to Guadalupe Church, which was just a block away from our little Methodist church. And what happened was that in those days, that's the way things were. There was a little bit, especially among Hispanic Catholics and Protestants, there was tension for historical reasons in Mexico. So the priest, when he found out that my mother had married a Protestant, refused to give her communion. And so my mother decided, well, she needed to be with my dad and the children. So, and then she became a very, very committed, especially United Methodist woman. She, and as it happened, my father in the 80s left the church, explored other religions, and resurfaced as a Catholic. So,
wow.
Yes. And also that impacted me growing up because in the summertime when we'd go to Mexico to spend summers with my grandmothers, we were Catholics. My grandmother was not about to take us. My Methodist grandmother had died. She died when I was just a few months old. And so I called myself later summer Catholic and a winter Methodist. But in both cases, my grandmothers really had a strong influence on my dad, my Methodist grandmother, and on my mother's side, her mother and grandmother. So our faith, whether it's Catholic or Methodist, the faith tradition has always been at the center of our family's lives, and I think that's the greatest legacy of my parents. So, and also I see now that why I'm such an committed to ecumenical reconciliation among Catholics and Protestants in the Hispanic realm. I'm not sure how it is among other groups, but there's not as much tension as there used to be, and I'm always looking for efforts to bring us together.
That's good.
Mm-hmm.
What did a normal day at home look like?
I'm sorry?
What did a normal day at home look like?
Well, depending on our age, and if it was summertime, that's why I'm so attached to Mexico, because it was all fun. I was the only girl, so I was very spoiled by both my grandmothers. I had a grandmother, my mom's mom, lived in Nuevo Laredo, in the Mexican side. And her aunt, who was like a grandmother, I had lost my dad's mom, so she was like a grandmother. And they were always competing for the grandchildren, especially me, since I was the only girl. And one would take me everywhere and buy me clothes and tal, and the other one would take me with her everywhere to every single weekend. Either it was a quinceañera or a communion or a baptism or a baby shower or a wedding. And everybody was invited. You might invite 100 people to your wedding, but 500 would show up. And somehow everybody got taken care of at the wedding. And in those days, the newspaper actually published, for like someone was getting married, who were all the godparents? Godparents of photography, godparents of luggage, godparents of honeymoon trip, godparents of the dress. Everything other people paid for, the godparents. That was a tradition. That's how people, even very poor people, could have really nice weddings or quinceañeras. And it was just a wonderful time to grow up in a small, Nuevo Laredo then was a small town. It was in the 50s. So when I lived in Spain for 15 years, and I just remember that all my nostalgia and memories and longing and for food were always of Mexico. Although, of course, I missed Oreos and just every other thing, Jell-O, things like that. Yes, I had longing for that too, but I really didn't have much of a longing for Dallas. It was my happy memories of growing up in the summertime. Of course, no school, so what can I say? So that was a typical day, was just being, having fun. And in Dallas, I always associated, of course, with school. And I loved school. I loved going to school, but I don't have it was more like duty. I had a lot of chores at home, all of us. My mother she was very different in that she didn't, since I guess maybe she only had one daughter, she couldn't count on me to do everything. So my brothers got to iron and wash and dishes and dust and all that. So we were all equally encouraged to do chores. So, but I do have fond memories of church, because that was, like I say, the center of our lives. And back then, we couldn't afford to, but back then we didn't have as much participation of children in teams and lessons of this, that, and the other. that was our social life. Going to church on Sunday, Sunday morning, Sunday evening, Wednesday evening, and all my parents' friends were their church friends, and they all had a bunch of kids like us. So they would be inside drinking coffee and eating their pan dulce and chatting, and we would be outside running around going crazy. So that was fun. And we used to have baseball games, and between the churches, there were at that time there were 3 Hispanic churches, Spanish-speaking churches. And the other thing, that's the other gift of the church to me, was I learned how to read and write in Spanish, because in Dallas, back then we did not have bilingual education, and there was no way you could actually study Spanish. But not that I studied it, but from the hymn book, we would sing the hymns, and then I'd figure out, oh, that's how you spell such and such and pronounce. And so reading the hymn book and the rite of baptism, or following along with the Holy Communion rite, that and the trips to Mexico in the summer allowed me to continue to have my language, because Spanish was my first language. My parents didn't speak English. Well, my mother did, because she went to high school, but my father didn't, so at home we only spoke Spanish. And I didn't really learn English till I went to kindergarten. So I know what it's like to start a new language at school. School, I guess, I associate so much with English, and I loved school, loved English. I love both languages, I really do.
That's nice.
Mm-hmm.
How would you describe race relations growing up?
Race relations. Well, I think we were very sheltered, because at that time, I'm talking about the 60s, I went to North Dallas High School. I went to Rusk Junior High back then. And I want to say I graduated North Dallas in 1966. And back then you went from 7th grade, the elementary school went to 7th grade, then 8th and 9th were junior high. So you didn't go to high school till you 10th grade. So I probably started 10th grade at North Dallas High School in 1963. And I think we had one African-American student, young man. And by that time, by the 60s, we had perhaps a quarter of the students were Hispanic, and I was one of them. And I don't want to say there was segregation, but I've talked about it with my friends that were Hispanic in high school with me. And there was a sense, not for me so much, because I kind of was, I want to say, I wasn't a loner. I had lots of friends, but I didn't date, and I didn't have that social life that's normal in a high school, that kind of social life. I was just a little bookworm, and I had just my few girlfriends, and they were all Hispanic. And yet at school, I tended to interact more with the Anglo girls, not hardly at all with any boys, Anglo or Hispanic. I was so shy, and it didn't help that I had been double promoted in the 1st grade, so I was a year younger, and it never occurred to me to understand why I always felt so out of it and so ignorant. It's because I was younger, and so that didn't help my social skills at all. And so I can't say there was conflict or discrimination, but I know there was. At first, I thought that was the reason that I had a full scholarship. I received a National Merit Scholarship. That meant that all my college expenses were covered. And not once did the counselor ever call me to say, well, Cynthia, congratulations. How can I help you decide on what college you want to go to? And I'll tell you, India, this is God's intervention. The only college that I got a brochure from was Our Lady of the Lake College, which is a Catholic girls' college, women's college. They called it girls' school. And I almost went there because I thought, oh, they want me. And that would have been my only reason. And I didn't. I decided to go to UT Austin. And you're going to laugh when you hear why. Because back then, the Texas OU game was already a big deal. And it seemed like they were winning a lot of games. They must be a good school if they're winning all their college games. So that's why I picked UT. Because I could pick any college I wanted to. But I didn't know how to apply. If I had wanted to go, I had heard of Vassar because I looked at the Mademoiselle magazine and 17 magazine. And I'd heard of it. It looked very glamorous. And I contemplated, but I'm glad I didn't choose that. I would have been so lost. Who knows what had happened to me. So UT Austin was a magnificent school. Back then in the 60s, it was an awesome school. And I was really glad that they were winning their football games. So as far as high school, any other, and I found out that years later, talking with, I still keep up with some of my high school friends, and we found out that the counselor did that to everybody. That I guess she didn't feel that that was her purpose in life, was to help any student get into college. Who knows why? So, but I'll tell you another thing that happened to me in college that I felt, not because I was Hispanic, but I felt it as discrimination. How do you say it? It wasn't religious, maybe it was political, but I was in high school when John Kennedy was assassinated, and we had just seen him because the motorcade went by North Dallas High School almost. So we were walking. So we were so excited, and we had seen him, and they had allowed us to go off campus and eat lunch off campus and just be back by 12:30 or something. And then when we got back to campus and we saw people listening in their car radios, and then we went to the school, and it was just, we're just stunned. But back then, there was no grief counseling. There was no, nobody considered our feelings or anything. And that, I think that was I want to say that was the only time I felt not discriminated, just oppressed, that we couldn't express our feelings. Those of us that were grieving because our president had been killed. And the irony was that all this took place in our American history class, and we also talked about it. And other people that were not Hispanic felt the same way. American history was happening, and she just kind of just ignored it. She was furious that the principal had interrupted our class. We were taking a test. We had to take the test no matter what. And then he had interrupted her class coming on the speaker to announce that President Kennedy died at 1 p.m. this afternoon. And I didn't know about that till later, but it was, I guess, the feeling of not even knowing that you were kind of suffering an injustice on top of your grief for the president's death. So otherwise, I was a happy camper in high school, as far as in my very narrow existence of no dates. I didn't have my first date till I got to college. That's my parents, though. My father was very protective, overprotective. And so anyway, in college at UT, A little bit that the discrimination was kind of concealed. Like, I didn't find out till years later that at our dorm, all the kind of sort of people that didn't fit in, we were put in one wing. And all the people that did fit in, all the sorority, this was a women's dorm. Back then we didn't have mixed dorms. They were kind of together. So there was that segregation. But I didn't even have a clue until many years later somebody else, one of the people on my wing that was my friend, pointed it out. And then I thought, how come all my friends are just so strange? Air Force brats and just different. Of course, I was the strangest one, probably. But, and I was the only Hispanic in that whole entire dorm. And that was because, and I'm sorry I picked that dorm because I would have liked to meet people that were not so weird. I mean, as much as I loved them, they were very crazy. And I would have liked to pick people like me that had loved academics and, you know. But that dorm, the only reason I picked it was because it had air conditioning. And my house didn't have air conditioning. I wanted to live in an air-conditioned dorm. But, oh, that was such a mistake. Such a mistake. Because everybody had, this was another kind of feeling odd. Everybody had, back then, it was a big deal to have Papagalo shoes. The right kind of shoes, the right kind of clothes that were in 17 magazine. And of course, I never could ever afford any of those clothes. But that was my big thing. I have got to get a pair of Papagalo shoes. And I did. I got 2 pairs. I felt very, very accomplished. But the other girls, they had like 20 pairs or 30. So it just kind of made me feel a little weird. But anyway, as far as classes, professors, no, none. I'd never ever felt that concealed or otherwise was there discrimination. It was just in my dorm.
What did you study in your undergrad?
Spanish.
Spanish.
Again, I had not a clue what I was going to do with my life, and so I knew Spanish, and it was a good choice. I mean, I think it came from the inside, wanting to be a teacher. That's what I am, and that's what I expected to do after college, was to teach Spanish, and I eventually, by a long kind of detour, came back to that.
So what happened after you graduated?
Well, what happened was that in my junior year, by my junior year, I was because I had placed out of all my basic Spanish, I was already in my sophomore year taking like junior, senior level classes. And that was an amazing experience. Academically, that's what I was really hungry for, is all this learning. And we had, at that time, top faculty in Spanish literature. And one of them, he was like, you know, I so looked up to him, was Ricardo Gullón. And he had actually fought in on the Republican side during the Spanish Civil War. So he had a lot to say about, for example, he had no regard for Ernest Hemingway. He said he was a fake. He stayed back in the hotel. He was never on the front lines. And then I remember when he said that when Federico Garcia Lorca, who's a great, great poet, he says when he actually knew him, he knew all the poets of that generation. that we were studying, he said when he walked into a room, it was like the sun had come into the room. And it's all these. And I remember that 1967 was the year that it's been called the greatest novel of the 20th century, 100 Years of Solitude, when that was published. And we were reading it in 1967 because all the professors knew that this was like a huge deal. And so we were among the first students to read that. And all my classes in Spanish literature classes, they really had a very strong influence. So he encouraged me to participate in, it's a summer program in Spain that was, I think it was Barnard College. I'm not sure. But anyway, Barnard and several other Ivy League schools had a program in Madrid, so I went there. And the very first week I was there, I met my future husband.
Wow.
So this is why the detour. So that was summer of 69, when we landed on the moon. I remember hearing about it on the bus going back from Cuenca to Madrid. And so thank God I had enough common sense. I didn't have too much common sense back then, but I had enough common sense to finish college. And so I came back and took off a semester to pay for my trip. So I got a scholarship, but I still had a lot of money. Worked here at the Dallas Public Library for that semester. And finished and graduated in 1970. And announced to my parents, I'm going to marry this guy. And I had known him like for 6 weeks. Crazy, I tell you. I did not have much common sense. And my poor parents. Now that I'm a parent, my children are 30-something, but both boys. And they've done a few little crazy things. And I said, payback. My poor parents. Their only daughter to just go off and marry someone that they had never met. So, but he was a really good guy. So he wrote this really nice letter to my dad in Spanish. And so I think that kind of eased my dad's fears. Not my mother's, but at least my dad. And they had a really good relationship. They didn't really get to meet, kind of convivir, means to share time together very much, but they had really, they bonded, and so that was a great thing. So that's why I went in September right after I graduated. I had to work all summer to pay for my plane ticket. Went back in August of 1970, and then we got married in January 71. For 15 years. That's where my kids were born, 2 boys, and then we separated in 85, and I came back here. So, Mom, I've been here longer than I lived there, but for a long time, it has a huge place in my heart. Spain and Cuenca specifically, and it's my children's birth town, so hometown. So but anyway, I was giving you that detour that when I came back, I became a bilingual ed teacher in Dallas School District. So that was, and I was so happy. I guess I've never been happier in that first year of teaching with 3rd graders, 3rd grade bilingual. I've never had so much fun. And I had a lot of fun until my professor I went to study for my master's in Spanish. She encouraged me to get my master's, not in bilingual education, but in Spanish, so I could teach in college. And that's what I did. In 95, I got my master's, and then taught 1 year at a private school, and then came to SMU. That was in 96.
Where did you get your master's degree from?
Well, since I'm from UT, I don't want to say Texas A&M Commerce, so I'm proud to say East Texas State University. That's what it was. I mean, that's what it's on my diploma, not Texas A&M Commerce. So.
And how was teaching at SMU like?
I loved it. It was, I was a lecturer, and that meant that I was only able to teach language classes, not literature. You have to have a PhD to teach any literature classes. So mostly freshmen and sophomores, first year, sometimes second year level classes. And it was a lot of fun. I really enjoyed my classes. One of the things I'm proudest of is we started a new course where we incorporated service learning into students could get credit for working in the community at a nonprofit but they had to be able to use their Spanish, and they had to do flyers in Spanish, things like that. And so they allowed me, and I thought that was really wonderful. And then the other wonderful experience at teaching here was my first summer here. I couldn't understand why nobody wanted to sign up to teach in Taos. Why wouldn't you want to teach in Taos? Well, it was because it was 6 weeks. Nobody wanted to be gone for 6 weeks. And so, but I thought it was great, so I signed up for it my first summer here. And it was just the most wonderful experience ever. I tell my kids, we need to, now they're married, and I have one granddaughter with one and a baby on the way with the other. And I said, next summer, we're going to have to do Return to Taos, all of us, at Fort Bergwin. So I don't know how I can make that happen, but if it's possible, I'm going to find out. Yeah. My sons were 14 and 15, and they just, I taught I don't remember, 2 or 3 hours in the morning, and I had the whole day to myself. And they were gone with sometimes the geology professor or the biology. They were just like little, everybody just loved having these little teenagers around. So they played on the volleyball team. They had a ball, and I had a good time because they were having fun, and everything was paid for, and it was like teaching there was just like a holiday. So, but that was the only time I did that in the summer. So what else? That was when I was working here, was when I began the connection with the course of study at Perkins. And that connection really is what led me to go to theology school, and Perkins was really an important part. So being a student at Perkins, which is, I guess, what really our conversation is about. What was it like to be a student here? I'm so thankful. I got a scholarship because I'm Latina. The General Board of Higher Education offers scholarships to African American, Latinos, any minorities, Asians, to study at seminary. And our Rio Grande conference, which was back then all the Spanish-speaking churches, and you know about that, every year they offered scholarships. They provided full tuition. So since I lived here in Dallas, I didn't have to worry about room and board. So it was just an amazing blessing, which I'm very grateful for. And I'm very proud. Like I say, I was 59 when I started, and I graduated in 3 years. So it's not easy. And it was not easy studying theology. It's like the hardest thing I've ever studied, ever. It's like studying philosophy. And but I made it. So, and it has obviously had a big impact on my life to have studied theology. and just incredible professors that I had. And I love my experiences every summer with Course of Study. Meeting the pastors from these tiny little churches all over, mostly all over Texas, but some from New Mexico. Hearing about their experiences, it just, their devotion, they were like true pastors that I'll never forget. It still makes me cry when I think about it, about this. We had a meeting of women clergy, even though I wasn't clergy, I was invited. And they were sharing their experiences. So within a conference that's already, has meager resources, well, the women pastors in that conference have even fewer. And this pastor was talking about, and she's going to be at Course of Study this summer, completing her the Course of Study, of having to bathe in the kitchen sink. Didn't have a bathtub, and everybody knew who she was because she's the only person that rode a bike because she didn't have money for a car. So that was just one tiny example. Another woman from the Oklahoma Indian Missionary Conference who had a 5-point charge. I don't even see how a 2-point charge pastors can take care of 2 churches. Well, she took care of 5. And so, until you really talk to people on the ground, you don't know what situation is. So if I could do something to help our higher echelons to understand and know what's going on the ground, I would like to. And we're trying to get the pastors of Spanish-speaking churches to come together and form a caucus. Like we have I think it's Black Methodist for Church Renewal is the African American caucus within our denomination. So we're trying to get a group like that, similar. It's called Marcha, and we're trying to get a chapter here in Dallas. There isn't a single Marcha chapter in all the South Central jurisdiction, not just our conference, the whole jurisdiction. And so, Indy, are you a Methodist?
I'm sorry?
Are you Methodist?
Oh, no, ma'am, I'm not.
Oh, because you seemed like you knew about the Rio Grande Conference.
In one of her previous interviews, the interviewee talked about it, so that's how I knew about it.
The Rio Grande Conference is kind of like what this little church was to me here in Dallas, but it's like the big church, because every year we would get together, like the United Methodist Women would have their annual meeting, and then they'd have the annual conference. So people came from all over Texas and New Mexico. And so we all knew each other year after year, seeing each other. And so that was, to me, so special to have a real connection every year, to see all these familiar faces at our gatherings. And we've all very much aged. So now I'm one of the elders. And so many wonderful people that have just nurtured our faith. And so you feel like you have not just your own family, not just your local church family, but you have a huge family. It's all resources and all, supporting you, really. So that's something I miss, because now it's no longer exists. So that's what we're trying to build in the North Texas Conference, some awareness of ministry among the Spanish-speaking people. So.
What other work have you done besides your work with the ministry?
You mean besides teaching and... Well, since 1989, I've been very, very involved with Dallas Area Interfaith, which I don't know if you're familiar. Dallas Area Interfaith is a grassroots community organizing organization. I don't know if you've heard of Faith in Texas or Texas Organizing Project. They do similar work. They teach people how to organize for their own, issues that affect them. Like something as small as getting a stop sign or sidewalks for your children's school to finding an alternative to payday lending, and that's kind of like a, how do you say it? It's a detriment to our neighborhoods. And just one example. And it's faith-based. That means you don't join as an individual, you join the church, or mostly it's churches, there are some schools. They join, and we had our founding convention. Next year it'll be 25 years ago at McFarland Auditorium.
Wow.
3,000 people. It was we're going to organize some kind of a celebration of the 25 years. But I want to look up the newspapers from that time, because we made the front page of the Metro section. And it was the only organization of its kind, because it was Black, Latino, white, Asian, Jewish, Protestant, Catholic, North Dallas, South Dallas. It was just so diverse. It was so perfectly diverse. And just did a lot of great work. And one of the things I'm proudest of is that we organized for after-school programs. I'm talking about the early 90s, let me see, 93, 94. There was no such thing as after-school programs. And we would go to talk to people, and they said, our responsibility ends at 3 o'clock. And that was, latchkey children were being, that were on the forefront of the community's minds. And so it was a huge, long battle, but now every single DISD school and other schools know that after-school programs are are great investment of their time and treasure. And so that we work to get a workforce training program in partnership with El Centro College to help people that had minimum wage jobs to be able to have $15 to $20 an hour jobs, support their families. I went to their most recent graduation, 51 people, and only 2 of them were selected to tell their stories, but they were amazing stories. And most of the people in there are like in their 30s, 40s, even 50s. And to have a kind of nobody straight out of high school. This is really a program to help people that kind of didn't go to college and have been working, a lot of single parents, to complete their training or certification. And the thing I'm really just very happy with is how they've understood that it's not just a matter of giving people money to go to school. It's like a whole umbrella of services, counseling, and maybe this month or week I don't have money for gas. This month I don't have money to pay my utilities. That financial help is available, but it's more the moral support, because I do not know what it's like. Well, I do know what it was like. When I was getting my master's, I had a full-time job and I had 3 boys. I was married by then, and my husband had a little boy my children's age, so we had 3 children. And then I had to work. My husband was going to school full-time, so I had to work extra at Richland College teaching Spanish, so I know kind of what it's like to be single income as a teacher. Of course, these folks, for the most part, they had minimum wage jobs before going into this program. So it's just that support that you need when you think, I can't do this anymore, but finding the strength. And so that's called Skill Quest, and it's still going strong. And then these mothers that don't speak English, they undocumented for the most part, but parents of children at one of our member schools and a charter school, and they were able. It took them about 1.5 years, but they were developed and helped to go before city council and housing, all of the bureaucracy of the city of Dallas. And their goal was to update the housing inspection code. Hadn't been updated like in 30 years. And the reason being that the apartments they lived in were in such deplorable conditions. And the people didn't have any recourse because, for the most part, they were told, well, if you don't like it, move. Because they didn't have documents. And that's the only housing they could acquire, because they weren't being asked for all the things that normally apartment managers ask for. Background check and driver's license and checking account information, whatever. So, and they did it. They won. And it was just like such an amazing. So DAI is really the only organization that does that develops grassroots leaders. And so it's almost 30 years that I've been involved in that.
That's nice.
Yeah. So I think between community, church, working, my family, that's about it for me.
That was all wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing all of that.
Thank you for, I didn't know I had so much to say.
This was wonderful. Thank you.
Thank
for agreeing to be
you.
a part
Thank
of
you,
our
India, and
project.
thank you, Carson.